Hi everybody, my name is Brad Kramer and this is Tim Harvis. Today we're going to be talking about some information you should know about having a workplace emergency response team or first response team, some resources that are there for you, training and stuff like that, what the Osha standard says about it, and a little bit extra information on that as well as what you should have in your first aid kit and stuff like that. So first of all, introducing Tim here. Tim is our Provenio's first aid and CPR trainer, and he does some other trainings as far as like drug and alcohol impairment recognition and stuff like that. So Tim has about 20 years of experience in law enforcement, right?
Yep.
And you've been a EMT?
For all of it.
Yep, so he's been on one or two calls, right, that have responded to a few incidents.
Yep.
And like I said, my name is Brad, and I've been a safety manager and now a consultant, as well as being a firefighter, and I'm currently an emergency medical responder. So I've been on a lot of different emergency response teams in the workplace and stuff like that, so I'll share some of the information that I've learned from there with you to help you out here. So first of all, let's cover what the OSHA standard is for emergency response teams. So here we have the OSHA standard book, pretty long book, and right here is our standard on emergency medical service and first aid. So it's one of the shortest standards in the book. Doesn't give you a whole lot of information and guidance on there, so break it down just a little bit. We're just gonna, the only one I'm gonna read here is gonna be 1910-151B. And that's 2 sentences long. In the absence of an infirmary, clinic, or hospital in near proximity to the person shall be adequately trained to render first aid. Adequate first aid supplies shall be readily available. Tells you a whole lot, doesn't it? Well, that's where we actually look at the letters of interpretation that OSHA has on it and gives you a little bit more information on what they say that means. So, looking at the letter of interpretation, there's a number of them for the standard, but they all kind of boil down to the same thing. OSHA finds the what an adequate response time is 3 to 4 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about, we're in Albert Lea, so about how far out from, say, downtown would 3 to 4 minutes response time be for most of our emergency response crews?
We could probably reach to most edges of the city in 4 to 5 minutes. So we're fairly lucky here, but there's going to be cases where we're limited by our resources, where we might have an ambulance that's already busy on a call somewhere. We could have the fire department out on a fire. We could have law enforcement all busy too, and then all of that's going to affect response times.
So even on the edge of town, we might be looking at 4 to 5 minutes, assuming that our resources aren't tied up elsewhere, right? So that doesn't, there's a lot of businesses then that should be looking at having an internal response team in case something happens, right?
Absolutely.
So 3 to 4 minutes doesn't buy you a whole lot of distance from, an ambulance garage, fire department, law enforcement center, somewhere like that that's going to have where people are going to be dispatched from to help. And also, this standard applies to virtually everybody. So if you have an office facility, so let's say you're an accounting firm, law firm, bookkeeping firm, something like that, where you're just an office firm, or I shouldn't say just, but that's, we don't consider those to be real high risk, you should still be having a first response team if you're more than that 3 to 4 minutes from emergency medical services. All right, so when we look at what you would have for a first response team, and you might call it first response team, medical response team, first responders, emergency medical responders, something like that within your facility, but kind of all the same thing. Your robustness, how many people you have trained, what you have for supplies and stuff like that would depend on looking at the risks that you have in your business. So we'll get to that here in just a few minutes. Now going back to training, the different types of trainings that are out there. Tim, what kind of trainings are available?
At the bare minimum, you have basic first aid training, and basic first aid covers the gamut of medical emergencies, injury emergencies, environmental emergencies like heat and cold related emergencies, poisonings. Within that training, you also get a pretty good grip on what you should have for supplies in your first aid kit. Beyond that, CPR training, great to have. Cardiac arrest knows no boundaries. It can happen to anyone, anytime. It's always good to have people that are trained in CPR ready to respond when something happens, where seconds really do matter in those cases. The quicker somebody can get help, the better chance they have to survive a cardiac arrest. With that, we can also provide AED training. Many businesses and companies throughout the city, private churches, schools, public buildings, we've got AEDs all over this community. So the AED training that we provide helps these employees not only in their workplace but off duty as well, establishing a level of comfort and confidence that you'd be able to grab an AED anywhere you see one and actually use it to save someone's life.
Would you say that over your career of training people in first aid and CPR, have you had many people come back to you and say that they used it at home on a loved one or something like that outside of the environment they were trained?
Absolutely. I've had a few cases too where I've been in the middle between teaching a class, taking a day off, teaching another class, and incidents have happened in workplaces where people have choked on things in the break room, and other employees who have taken the class have come back and said, hey, I got to use that like right after I learned it. And it's a good feeling for them. It's a good feeling for us to know that the training really does pay off.
Absolutely. And if there's if somebody works in the healthcare field or they're first responders, say on a fire department or something like that, they need BLS, right? That's an additional level of training that you provide?
Yep, so the basic life support course, it goes quite a bit deeper into supporting someone after a cardiac arrest. So we work in teams versus the lower level of CPR courses where we work as a single rescuer. In BLS, we have much more focus on working in a group. We add in a couple more tools of the trade to that class too that are more likely to be found in places that have higher levels of training.
And there are also higher levels of training. So when we're talking about like EMRs, emergency medical responders, or EMTs or paramedics, sometimes you'll have somebody on staff that maybe they're on an ambulance crew or on a fire department or something else where they bring that additional level of training. Or maybe you have a nurse on staff, and of course that nurse has a higher level of training as well. So with that higher level of training there's going to come with it more capabilities and stuff like that you can add to your toolbox to control any incidents. Some other things that might come into play when you consider how much training should you have, how many people. Are you in like a high-risk facility or something like that where you have maybe a hazmat team or a HAZWOPER team? Maybe you do a lot of confined space entry and you're your own rescue service or your own rescue team, so you'd want those folks trained as well so that they can respond rather quickly. Or if you have other extreme hazards. So some examples might be if you, for one thing, there are some industries that are required to have higher levels of training in that, such as electricians, loggers, and other services like that. Construction standard has their own requirement for having people on the job site that are trained as well. So that would come into play. So when we look at doing a risk assessment, what's in your business? What likely might happen? What should you be prepared for? You want to look around your facility, look at those risks. You're not taking that, what's that one thing that really could happen that's not likely? Let's say a tornado knocking down your building and stuff like that. We're not really stocking our first aid equipment for that, something that just might happen with a real vague chance. We're looking at what realistically would be likely to happen. So let's say I had a metal fabrication shop, right? We got a lot of sharp metal, including expanded and some of those sheet metals that are extremely sharp, and those can cause some severe bleeding injuries. Looking at large equipment such as shears, brake presses, and stuff like that has a lot of power and uses a lot of electricity. So if somebody gets electrocuted or caught up in that, entangled in that equipment or something like that, there you have higher risk. Stuff like that compared to, let's say you have an office environment where Most likely your highest risk would be a personal injury, or something personal, such as cardiac arrest, having a stroke, seizure, diabetic incident, something like that, would be your greatest concern there. So looking at what are those reasonable risks that your facility might have. And then also that time for response. If I was responsible for putting a response team in place in, say, a metal fabrication shop, even if I was right across the street from an ambulance garage, there's still going to be time for, someone has to call 911, dispatch has to alert the ambulance, and then the EMTs actually have to get there across the street. So even if that might be probably 1.5 minutes at best for that response. And if you have a lot of high risk, severe lacerations and stuff like that 1 to 2 minutes can be a big deal if you don't have the equipment in your first aid kit. So definitely, no matter where I had that facility, I would be looking at having some serious bleeding control supplies there. Versus even if I had, let's say I had an office firm and I'm kind of out in the country, maybe in a rural setting, 5 to 10 minutes away from an ambulance. There I'm going to be looking at my risks, being maybe AED, a little less on the bleeding control side, but for sure having like a CPR one-way valve and stuff like that, so people can perform quality CPR, having that PPE on site and stuff like that. So also the other thing to look at is what's the scope of the team that you have trained. So if you have a nurse on site or an EMT or emergency medical responder, somebody like that with that high level of training, first of all, have that conversation with them, what they're comfortable doing for the business. They might be an EMT on an ambulance, but really not feel comfortable doing that level of care when they're, say, in the workplace as an employee. So you might have to have that discussion. Usually people like that are perfectly willing to bring those skills to the workplace and have that additional role, but they want to make sure they're protected by you as the employer as well, right? So when we think about having a first aid kit, what you should have in there, this is what I keep in my car because, like I said, I'm an EMR, so a little bit higher level of care, but I'm on the road quite a bit, so my chances of coming across an accident in a rural setting are a little higher. So I keep a little pretty well-stocked jump bag in my car, for example. So I have oral airways, for example. Now, in first aid and CPR in your basic level of training, this doesn't get covered, right?
Nope.
So if you didn't have people who were that higher level of training or say risk in your facility where an oral airway might be needed, probably wouldn't even want to have that in your kit. Just takes up space and just a little bit added liability. But definitely, pretty much no matter where we're at, we're going to want the basic, the gauzes and the wraps, different types of bleeding control supplies and stuff like that, bandages, but really looking up there from what's your level of risk. Do you want to talk about a tourniquet a little bit, whether
Sure.
that's something you should have?
In cases where bleeding is one of your risks or severe bleeding, it would be good to have a manufactured tourniquet in your first aid kit. While there's several manufacturers that are making tourniquets, we usually do a little bit of basic training with the North American Rescue CAT tourniquet and teach people how that's applied and what the benefits of that are. Depending on your situation, you can lose a lot of blood very quickly, and you can go unresponsive from blood loss in less than a minute. Seconds really do matter in a case of major bleeding or traumatic amputation. Just an industry that's out there that recently added some tourniquets that I'm aware of is utility workers. They carry chainsaws on every one of their trucks. They go out in storms and they cut tree limbs down, clean off power lines on a regular basis, and they really weren't aware that maybe they should have a tourniquet on every truck that has a chainsaw. And so some of our local government crews that also operate chainsaws for tree trimming have added tourniquets to their kits. They're fairly inexpensive for the value of what you get. You can stop a major bleed very quickly if you're properly trained to use the tourniquet.
And there's been a lot more science going into them behind, with the military deployments and stuff like that, where we know a lot more about how they work and doctors recommend them a lot more. They don't have that stigma they used to have, right?
Yeah, that stigma of long term, if you know, put a tourniquet on somebody, they're going to lose their limb. That's just not necessarily the case anymore. There's several examples from the medical community where tourniquets have been applied and taken off up to 12 hours after the application, where the person has regained full functioning of whatever limb they were placed on.
So we'll kind of move now into kind of the final, what we're going to cover here today, some liability and just some of those housekeeping items. So when we talk about the Good Samaritan Law, who does that apply to?
So the Good Samaritan Law in Minnesota applies to someone who renders aid during a first aid or cardiac arrest emergency. It does not apply to persons who receive or expect to receive compensation for that care. So in the case of a on-duty paramedic, nurse, police officer, firefighter, EMT, whose job it is to provide that care, they're not going to be covered under that Good Samaritan Law in the scope of their duties. However, off duty, they may very well be covered by that. And what that law protects you from is any civil liability resulting from an action or an inaction during an emergency.
So if you have a first response team for your company and you're on that first response team, maybe you get a bonus or something like that for being on it. That would be part of your job then if somebody had an injury. So that might not apply to you, but there's courts are typically very reluctant to hold somebody responsible if they acted within the scope of their training and using what somebody would find reasonable care. For example, there's an incident where somebody was watching Grey's Anatomy and sometime later somebody was choking and they did an emergency tracheotomy on them. This wasn't a doctor or somebody with that higher level of training, so they did a tracheotomy. So you would never want to, do something just because you saw it on TV, right? So that would definitely be an example of giving care outside the scope of your training.
Yep, you want to avoid any negligent action or any willful or wanton harm to that person.
Yep. So OSHA does require that you have that first response team in place if you're more than that 3 to 4 minutes away from medical care. Another thing that they've come out and said was let's say you have an employee that's trained in first aid CPR, something happens and that employee freaks out, they forget their training, they see blood and they faint or they can't provide care for whatever reason. OSHA looks at that and says, you did your due diligence, you trained them, they got the appropriate training, so they're not going to come back at you and fine you for, well, your employee didn't do their job. Well, they do take that into consideration, so you're not going to get in trouble if somebody kind of freaks out if they've had the appropriate level of training. So wrapping up, what as a responder, you went to a bunch of different emergencies and stuff like that over your career. What would you say are the things that have made the biggest difference in the calls that you arrived at, where somebody was severely bleeding or had a cardiac incident or something like that in the workplace?
Sure. Obviously, as a rescuer, you want to protect yourself first. Make sure you have the right equipment to do that. So a basic CPR mask costs you a few bucks. It's not really a big investment, but it'll pay you off dividends when you need to use it. We find a lot of people are fairly reluctant to do mouth-to-mouth breathing during CPR on someone that's not a close family member. We can't say we blame them for that at all, but give them the tools they need to do their job. And then second, most basic would be provide gloves for anybody that's rendering care, that first line of protection for them. Some of the other things you want in that kit that are going to make a big difference are make sure you have a supply of bleeding control things. So we're talking 4x4 gauze pads, rolled bandages, things like that. Be ready to handle most things. Make sure you have band-aids in there. Don't forget about the simple things. You definitely want to have a scissor in there that is capable of cutting through clothing to expose an injured area so you can treat it properly. Having a bottle of sterile water in your first aid kit is not a bad idea because you can use that as an eye wash. The quicker you can get a poison out of someone's eye, the better chance for them to have a full recovery. You can also use it for rinsing wounds. So those are some basic supplies that I would say you for sure want in there. If you are in that industry where you have that higher risk of severe bleeding, so you're working with sharp objects, any industry where it involves mechanical machines, we've seen through the years industrial accidents that have resulted in traumatic amputations. You definitely want to invest in the tourniquets in the first aid kit and get that bleeding under control. A lot of places now are pushing forward with putting the AEDs in their workplace. Your chance of surviving a cardiac arrest actually drops 7 to 10% for every minute that passes. The quicker we can get to somebody, the quicker we can start high quality CPR, and the quicker we can get an AED on and deliver a shock to that heart, the better the chances for recovery. So the cost of the units has come down substantially through the years. They're quite affordable. There's really not a lot that can go wrong with them as long as you keep up with the batteries and keep your pads up to date.
How about the level of training? Like, I'm sure you pulled up 2 scenes where they've had a response team where people just fell in place knowing exactly what they need to do versus pulling
Sure.
up to a scene where everybody's just frazzled, nobody knows what to do, and there that person lies bleeding or not having the level of care started on them by the time you got there.
Yeah, and generally we do find that most people want to help. They want to do something, and a lot of employees voluntarily sign up to take the first aid and the CPR classes, recognizing that it's going to benefit them in their personal life as well. Maybe they've been in a situation before where something's happened in front of them and they didn't know what to do, and they think, well, I should take that class, get up to speed on that, because I do want to be able to help and I want to be able to save somebody if it comes to that. In other situations, you got people running around all over the place that don't have any idea what's going on, and they're relying purely on their emergency services to respond and show up, and sometimes seconds can make the difference, let alone a few minutes of nobody doing anything. So the quicker, the more confident the employees are in their skills, the quicker they're going to act, and the more successful it's going to be.
And that might be looking at, do you do your training just every 2 years or when that certification is required, or maybe doing some additional training throughout the year. So having quarterly or every 6 months doing a refresher. That doesn't even have to bring in outside trainers, just getting together and keeping those skills and that information fresh in their mind, going through your first aid kit and stuff like that. So training doesn't have to be that scripted or that formal. So, but anyway, so we just covered a bunch of the topics, from having an emergency response team at your work site, what some of the laws are, requirements, what trainings are available and stuff like that. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at our website or email, www.provenioconsulting.com, and we'd be happy to answer any questions, or if you need training, work with you on that. Thank you very much.
You bet.
And thank you, Tim.
You bet. Thank you.
And have a great day.